Hello, glad that you're here. We're going to talk a little bit about finding and analyzing theme today, and the text we're going to use is the column "The Man in the Water" by Roger Rosenblatt. It first appeared in Time magazine. Alright, so as we mentioned, this feature column appeared in Time magazine shortly after the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 crashed in the Potomac River outside of Washington, D.C. Just a little bit of background. It focuses on one of the survivors who, when he was offered a rope to be rescued, continually passed the rope to other passengers until ultimately they came back for him and he had drowned in the river. This is a nonfiction piece. It's based on actual events, but we can still find a theme in Rosenblatt's writing. And so we're going to review quickly here how to find a theme. Just remember that stories are about lots of things, and those we call topics. So the first step in finding a theme is asking yourself, what is this story about? So if we took The Man in the Water, for instance, we could say it's about sacrifice, it's about everyday heroes, or even the epic struggle of man versus nature. So we could continue to make a list, but we'll go with those three. After that, the next step we want to do is ask yourself, what does we'd want to pick one of the a couple of the topics, or one or two of the topics that we want to explore, and then we would ask ourselves the question, what does the author believe about sacrifice, or about everyday heroes, or man versus nature? For this one, let's go ahead and we're going to choose man versus nature and sacrifice. And after we've read the article, by the way, if you need a copy of the article, you can just Google The Man in the Water PDF, and you'll get lots of copies of that that you could go ahead and read online. But in this case, I would say something like this: the author believes that man's selfless ability to save others' lives while choosing to sacrifice his own separates him from nature and ultimately can make him more powerful. That's kind of the main message, or what Rosenblatt, at least in my opinion, wants us to walk away from the story with. Alright, so we've found the theme, just that quick review. Now let's really talk about how to analyze that theme and how the author develops it, because Rosenblatt does a couple of things to try and develop that theme and bring home that point. So, when you're examining how the author develops the theme, what you want to do is pay attention to a few key parts of the story, mainly the plot and the characters. When we're looking at the plot, two special areas of focus is the conflict. What's the problem or the issue that the main character or characters face, and how does it get resolved? When we look at characters, we want to pay special attention to how they change over time. What do we learn, or what do they learn over the course of the story, the novel, or the article? So pay special attention to those things in the story, and you'll see authors doing specific things to help develop their theme. Alright, so if we did a little chart here about The Man in the Water, we can look at the plot and the conflict and the resolution. So let's start there. We'll look at the plot specifically with the conflict. Alright, the conflict is when the airplane crashes, there are survivors, and so we need to attempt to rescue these survivors. Are they going to be rescued, and how? How will this be resolved? Well, the resolution is in the face of death. Right, the man in the water offers rescue to others before himself. Others are saved, but of course he dies helping to save those that survive. Alright, so if we look at the characters, in this case we really have one, and he's really unnamed. We just know him as the man in the water. And we ask ourselves, how did they change? Well, before the accident, the man was probably just sitting on the airplane as an ordinary man. But because of the events he was thrust into, he became a hero. What do they, or really what do we learn in this case from this? We learn that although nature is indifferent to human suffering, humans are willing to sacrifice themselves for others. So nature doesn't care about the survivors in the water, but the man does. And this ultimately leads us to having a way of overcoming nature. Even though the man dies at the end, as human beings we think that we perceive that he won the battle because he saved the lives of others. So these are good ideas for us to start thinking about, to see what Rosenblatt did to kind of prove his theme. So we'll kind of use these as key ideas. Alright, so now we got to put these ideas into writing. The first step is to start with a big idea that everybody can relate to. Everyone's going to agree with it. And then we're going to expand the idea by connecting it to our text, the literature we're talking about. So here's an example. We'll put it in green. In most tragedies we find that there are heroes among us. Most everybody can agree with that. We've seen enough tragedies, unfortunately, on the news to find that people step up and do extraordinary things in tragedy. Alright, so that's our big idea. In most tragedies, we find that there are heroes among us. Next, we want to connect it to our text. These once ordinary people do extraordinary things. Alright, so we're connecting this big idea to our text. Of course, the man in the water does an extraordinary thing. So that's our first step. Start with the big idea. Next, we want to introduce the piece of literature and the author, and we're going to give a very brief summary of the work. You can notice here I do it in about 2 sentences. So again, we have our green words there. That's our big idea. But next, in blue, is where we introduce the literature. So I would say something like this. In his short work, The Man in the Water, Roger Rosenblatt, so there's the author, writes about the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 in the icy Potomac River. Letting our people know a little bit about the setting. It's cold, it's winter, it's the Potomac River. Among the survivors was one man who continued to pass the rescue rope to his fellow survivors. His heroic acts ultimately cost him his life. Okay, so 2, maybe 3 very short sentences. It's just a brief nuts and bolts. This is what the story's about. So we'll introduce the literature as step 2. Step 3 is to introduce the theme. Okay, we put that in red. So now we have a big idea. We've introduced the work and given a brief summary. Now we're going to do the theme. Rosenblatt shows that man's selfless ability to save others' lives while choosing to sacrifice his own separates us from nature and ultimately can make us more powerful. We could change us and put in humankind, mankind, if you want to get rid of that pronoun, but that's the theme. Okay, so that's our step 3, introduce the theme. Now for the rest of the paragraph, we're going to just use evidence and examples to show how the author develops the theme. Okay, we're going to follow a specific pattern. We're going to tell the reader what the author does, we're going to give an example of this, and then we're going to explain how it develops the theme. Tell the reader what it does, give an example, explain the theme. I once had a teacher that told me that a way to remember this is an acronym of P, P-E-E. So you point out what the author does, you give an example, it's the E, and then explain how it develops the theme. So point, example, explain. So if that's easier for you to remember, you can do that. So here's a couple of examples. Alright, so he does this, we're telling the reader what he does. He does this by contrasting the unflinching, uncaring march of nature versus the self-sacrificing man in the water. So that's what he does. Now here's the example. Rosenblatt states, nature cared nothing about the 5 passengers. Our man, on the other hand, cared totally. So he's contrasting them. So there's an example of that. Now I'm going to explain how it develops the theme. This helps the reader understand that although we are limited in our power against nature, humankind does possess strengths that nature does not. Ultimately, this gives mankind at least one advantage in this epic battle of man versus nature. Okay, again, point it out, tell what the author does, give an example, explain how it develops the theme. Okay, here, and now we just continue to give other evidence and examples. So here's another one. Near the end of the piece, Rosenblatt explains, since it was he who lost the fight, we ought to come again to the conclusion that people are powerless in the world. In reality, we believe the reverse. The man in the water pitted himself against an implacable, impersonal enemy. He fought it with charity, and he held it to a standoff. He was the best we can do. Here Rosenblatt underscores his theme that although man may often feel helpless in the face of nature, he is not powerless. Okay. Alright, so there's your finished paragraph. I'm not going to read the whole thing in lieu of time, but if you want to pause the video and read through it, you can see in green is where we had the big idea. In blue, we introduced the work and summarized it. In red, we introduced our theme, and then everything else in yellow is is where we're pointing out what the author did. We're using an example. We're explaining how it develops the theme. Now we could go ahead and if we wanted to, we could actually pull this out and make it into a whole paper, making it multiple paragraphs talking about each individual thing that the author does and giving a couple of different examples. In this case, it's just kind of an extended paragraph, but we could use this as an outline to make it a bigger paper if you would like, or if that's your assignment. For my class today, that is not the assignment. Alright, and then finally, remember the steps. Start with the big idea everyone can relate to, introduce the literature and give a brief summary, introduce the theme, give evidence and examples that show how the author develops the theme, and then repeat step 4 so you have multiple pieces of evidence. Thanks.